What determines how likely we are to conform? Well, there's a lot of different variables that determine whether or not we'll conform at any point in time. So, if there is one other person in your group who doesn't conform, who perceives the world or understands the world differently from everyone else in the group, so if there's one other person bucking the trend or, following their own path, then it's much easier for each of us to follow our own path as well. The more ambiguous a situation is, the more likely we are to conform. Makes sense. More ambiguous means we don't know what the right answer is. So if we don't know what the right answer is, it makes sense that we would conform, especially if there isn't time for us to find out what the right answer is. And it turns out that power dynamics play a really big role in conformity. If somebody has a very powerful status in a group or in society, they are much less likely to conform than people who have less power in the group or less power in society. Powerful people feel less of a need to conform. We're also more likely to conform when we're not particularly tied to the right answer. Maybe I'm more likely to conform to what my friends think if I don't have much of a vested interest in whatever it is we're talking about. You're also more likely to conform if we're part of a medium-sized group, not too big or not too small, and everybody else in the group believes that other thing, right? So when the group is unanimous, except for you, and the group is sort of moderately sized, you're more likely to conform. If we admire the group, if the group is something we want to be a part of, we're much more likely to conform. And you can see that in social cliques. Think back to high school, maybe the cheerleading group or the athlete group. If somebody was outside of one of those groups but wanted to join the group, they would conform, seriously conform, with the members of the group that they wanted to be a part of. If a group makes us feel insecure or like we don't really belong, or maybe makes us feel like we're on the edge of being kicked out of the group, we're more likely to conform. We don't want to be kicked out. We don't want to be expelled from our social group. So we'll do pretty much anything to stay in that group, including agree to whatever the group says, even if it's not true for us. And our culture also encourages us to conform in all sorts of ways. Now, remember back to that story I told you about Kitty Genovese being murdered in front of her apartment building, and no one called the police and no one reached out to help, even as she's screaming? That was studied after the Kitty Genovese murder, when psychologists tried to understand what the heck was going on. And when they conducted research on that topic, what they found is a phenomenon called bystander apathy, or the bystander effect. And it turns out the likelihood that any individual will help somebody else depends on whether that individual is alone or in a small group or part of a big group. So if I am the only one around and I see someone fall down, as the only person there, I feel all of the responsibility, so I am very likely to go over and help that person. But if I'm, say, in a group of 50 or 100 people and I see someone fall down, the likelihood of me helping that person is much smaller. There's this diffusion of responsibility. The idea behind this is we look around and think, no one else is helping. The situation is kind of ambiguous. Maybe I shouldn't help either. Now, let's think about this in terms of living in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, we have a very large number of people who are homeless. And so it's not uncommon to walk by someone who is homeless, who might be asking for money, or might be sleeping on a piece of cardboard or in a sleeping bag under a tent. Will you help that person? The bystander effect says whether you will help a homeless person depends on how many other bystanders are there. If you're all by yourself, you're much more likely to help. But if you're part of a group of people who's not helping, then the likelihood that you're going to help drops and drops and drops as the size of the group gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's not uncommon on city streets to see what you see in this picture. Someone lying on the sidewalk. It's unclear, are they sleeping? Do they need help? It's not entirely clear. And all sorts of people look and just walk right by because of the bystander effect, because everybody else is walking right by, so maybe I should too. Another thing that influences whether or not we'll conform is if we think that other people are experts in a particular area. So, for example, I think that Dr. Fauci is an expert in infectious diseases because he's run the National Institutes of Health Institute of Infectious Diseases for decades. And so I am very likely to conform to the rules that he sets out for how to deal with the COVID pandemic. If someone doesn't recognize Dr. Fauci as an expert, then they're much less likely to conform to his suggestions. Generally speaking, greater expertise in a field is associated with better knowledge. But experts are not always reliable. Here's a headline from CNN back in 2016 when Donald Trump was running not for the presidency, but to become the Republican Party's representative to run for the presidency. And back then, all the experts gave Donald Trump a 1% chance that he would be the Republican nominee for the presidency. What happened to all those experts? Conformity pressure influences experts too. Another situation in which we are highly likely to conform is in an emergency, right? What happens in an emergency? Well, you need to move quickly. You need to make decisions quickly. You don't have time to collect a lot of information. So what do? What everybody else is doing. If you're in a building and everybody starts running out of that building, what's the safest thing to do? Well, it may be to just join everybody else, with the assumption being that they know that something's wrong. And so you should follow their lead. If you see people who are scared and panicked and they're all running in the opposite direction that you're going, you're going to turn around and go with them. That's conformity. It's conformity to be right. You don't want to get that wrong. The problem is sometimes people don't behave rationally. They're running from something they don't need to run from. Thanks.